Hi, guys. Yeah, thank you. Cool. So my name's Aline, and I'm here to talk to you about, I think, part of the biggest part of any product manager's job, and kind of the cornerstone of a product manager's job, which is just saying a lot of no's to stuff. So when to do it, how to do it, and how to do it without making your team and your customers hate your guts. So first, a show of hands, how many of you are product people? Okay, that's great. Wait, leave them up, I'm not done. How many of you feel like this is one of the biggest and maybe hardest parts of your job? Great, keep them up, last one. And how many of you sort of take a secret thrill in saying no? Okay, well, you're the ones I want to drink with after this. So, me introduce myself a little. So, I was a software engineer for many years, and at some point I got really fed up with hiring. It was really hard, and it was annoying, and it was clunky, and it was just really hard to find people for my team. So I ended up sort of taking this side foray into recruiting, and then I just never left the industry. So I switched from engineering to recruiting. I ran hiring at a few companies, and then started my own recruiting firm. That ended up being kind of boring, so I ended up starting Interviewing.io. We're a marketplace that helps companies hire software engineers, as you heard. And I'm really trying to solve a lot of the frustrations that I felt when I was an engineer. Namely, one, just looking for a job feels like this sort of Kafkaesque shitstorm. But also just like good people often get overlooked because they don't look a certain way on paper, and that's what we care about a lot. In my bio, you probably heard that I've never been a product manager. I sort of was unglamorously thrust into that role in part when I became a founder, as probably some of you were as well. But I think I still have some interesting things to say on the subject of saying no for a few reasons. Just one is I'm very self-righteous. So I'm good at saying no, as my long-suffering team will tell you. But more importantly, our product is kind of weird because this is a B2B thing, but we're like B2B2C. So we're this marketplace, and on one side we have software engineers who are notoriously persnickety and kind of like hard to build for and have a lot of strong opinions, almost as bad as product people. And on the other side are employers. And they're the ones that pay us money, right? But engineers are the product. Like, they're the thing that we're selling, and they're the ones that are much harder to please, especially in this market where every recruiter is emailing them all the time saying, hey, we can get you a job. So it's on us to sort of serve one audience and get paid by another. And that creates this interesting tension and puts us in a situation where we have to say no a lot. So, great. So this is kind of a well-covered subject. If you Google when to say no to feature requests, you get a lot of really great material. My favorite is actually the Intercom product blog. I don't know if you guys read that. It's really, really good. And I actually stole this quadrant from there. But this is stuff that you guys already know, right? Like, one axis is effort. One axis is return on investment. And then, the ideal thing is like low effort and high return, right? So this is stuff you know already. And there are decisions that you can sort of think about like this, and then you get the right answer, and then it's very easy to convince yourself you're doing the right thing, and your team, and your investors, and everything's great. But there are some decisions that are a lot harder than that, right? Ones where you want to say no to something, but it's a little harder to quantify, or the problem doesn't really neatly lend itself to this kind of quadrant. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today, something hopefully that isn't as readily available in all the blogs. So I'll just tell you some war stories about times we've said no to things, and I hope you find them useful. But first, just a little bit about what we do, so you have some context for all the stuff that we've said no to. So I said earlier we're a two-sided marketplace. The way we get software engineers to even use our product is we offer them mock interviews. So finding a job is easy, getting invited to interview is easy, but actually interviewing is hard. So we offer people mock interviews, and then we use the data from these interviews to surface top performers who can then talk to companies directly on our platform. We have data, so we do well at this. We have a lot of senior engineers that are really hard to attract, and we've managed to do it. A lot of them come from non-traditional backgrounds, and we save companies a lot of time. And I'll just show you the candidate flow so you have some context. When you first join our platform, you can book practice. It's fully anonymous, so you can screw up, nobody knows who you are. Really, all you do is grab a time slot, and then at go time you show up. An engineer runs you through a very realistic technical screen. These are usually freelancers who work for us. And then at the end, you get some feedback. Hopefully that makes you better, but it also tells us who's good. And this is the coolest part. Once you're a top performer, instead of having to talk to recruiters or ask your friends to refer you or do any of that like cruft that doesn't really help you or make your life better, that Kafkaesque stuff I talked about earlier, you just look at the companies we work with, like those, you grab a time slot with one of them, and then you have an interview with Microsoft or with Lyft or with Coinbase, and it's anonymous. At the end, you unmask if you want, and then you go on site. So one thing you might have noticed is our flow that I shared here, and really how we think about our product is all about the engineer's experience, and I'll talk a little more about that. So first, not all no's are created equal, right? We already talked a little bit about effort to ROI. That's probably one of the main reasons you might say no to building something, but there are others, right? Something can be not your core business. It can be a distraction and have a high opportunity cost. In our case, we made a decision not to build our own interview environment, and we ended up licensing a tool called CoderPad, which is great, because building interview environments is not our core business. It's just a tool that we can use. Another example is something is not one of your core competencies and you couldn't support it. In our case, we decided very consciously and probably a little over-aggressively not to build for mobile, in large part because imagine trying to solve an algorithmic problem in code in your mobile phone, like reversing a binary tree by texting, probably wouldn't be really good. So we just said, screw it, we're not going to deal with mobile. Another reason could be duplicating functionality that already exists. So most of our customers use applicant tracking systems to track their candidates, and there's a lot of overlap between what we do and what the ATS does. And again, we made a conscious decision not to build any ATS features because customers don't want to be in two places at once, and then you just create extra work for them. But these are all like pretty straightforward. Here's the hard thing that I want to talk about today. The reason to say no. Building this goes against our mission and our values and maybe by extension, our brand. This is really hard to quantify a lot of the time. It's also really hard to justify, sometimes even to yourself. And frankly, this is a hard talk to give because hindsight is 20/20, but we're right in the middle of it right now. So it is very possible that everything we've done is completely wrong. I don't think it is, but you'll see in a moment what I'm talking about. So to put this in context, we only have one value at the company, and that is that we put candidate experience first. They are the product. They're hard to get. If they're not happy, it doesn't matter how great our dashboards are. Our companies are just not going to want to, it doesn't matter, right? And then our mission is to make hiring more efficient. The reason it's that and not something more noble sounding like, oh, we should make hiring meritocratic or fair, is that the business world doesn't care about doing the right thing, right? Companies care about doing things cheaper and better and faster. And the only way you can get them to do the right thing is to give them something that makes things easier for them in some way or another, right? So if we can make our experience, get them more candidates, better candidates faster, and those candidates also happen to be candidates that they probably wouldn't have gotten on their own, then we win. And these two principles sort of guide everything that we do. So when to say no, and just tell you some stories about that. And when we almost said no, but are really glad we didn't. And one case when we totally should have said no to something and sticking to our principles was the absolute moronic wrong thing to do. Okay. So here's some context. Our users typically are coming from organic channels rather than marketing. So the green part of the pie chart here is word of mouth. You can see almost half of our users are coming from that. The rest are coming from our YouTube channel, and I'll talk a little more about that, and our blog, but those are also organic sources. And you can see that organics are a big part of our business. Our organic signups are growing. So we've sort of invested in this idea of giving our users value and retaining them by giving them great stuff they can't get anywhere else. With that in mind, when we've said no to stuff, and these were all really, really hard decisions, and I'll just talk about each one. So whenever we try to sell a new company, we tell them, and our pitch is basically this: hey, do you want to talk to randos on the internet and give engineering time to that? We totally promise they're smart. So you can imagine that companies meet this with a healthy skepticism, given how expensive engineering time is. And a lot of our customers ask us to share our candidates' practice interviews and their performance in practice. And then, they can sort of decide who they want to talk to. This was a really hard thing for us to decide not to build. And the way we got around this is a lot of the time offering free pilots, very limited ones, and saying, look, you have no reason to trust us that our candidates are going to be 3 times better than what you're seeing elsewhere. So why don't you just talk to a few? At worst, you lose 3 or 4 hours. At best, you have a great new channel that's going to be cheaper and faster and better. And it turned out that, the reason they're asking for this feature isn't because they really care about watching candidates practice interviews. In fact, they really don't want to do that. If you're going to watch an interview, then you might as well do one. Like, it takes the same amount of time to watch somebody else. Maybe you can watch it at double speed, but it's still like a significant time investment. So they don't want to do that. They actually just really want smart people, and a lot of smart people fast. And we found a way to de-risk them trying it, and fortunately didn't have to build this, but it was hard. Another thing we said no to is integrating with ATSs for interview scheduling. So in a typical recruiting organization, there are a few different roles, right? And one of the roles is recruiting coordinator. And those are people whose job it is essentially to schedule interviews. So if you're applying for a job, one of the first things you'll do is email back and forth with a recruiting coordinator. Maybe that'll take you a few days, right? And you're finding a time to talk to a recruiter. Then, if that goes well, you have another email back and forth with a coordinator trying to find time to have a technical phone screen. And by the time you get to the part where you get to talk to another engineer and ask them about the roadmap and the tech stack and why they chose this company, you've probably invested a few weeks and sent a lot of scheduling emails. So we decided that we're not going to do that, and that just because companies have always done it this way doesn't mean that we have to do it this way. So we said, no, we're not going to do this. If you want to use our product, you have to use our scheduling system. So you have to actually onboard your interviewers. They have to set up their availability, and they have to sort of fall in line. Oh, what did I do? Thank you. Fall in line to this way of doing things, right? So they set up their stuff, candidates book, and that is the only way it's going to be. And that's also a really hard thing, right? Because most of the customers we're selling to are enterprises with a really, really established process and a very specific way of doing things. And it's really scary to say, nope, you have to have a process change. Fortunately, and this may not work for all of your businesses, fortunately we're in this position where companies are hurting so badly for candidates that they're actually willing to make some of these process changes. And it's kind of a continuum, like how much is a company willing to put up with before they just say they're not going to use you. But if what you're offering is valuable enough, and if you really believe that long term the customer is going to get more value out of doing things your way than their way, and there's a way to sort of show them that and have them believe it, then this makes sense. This was a very hard thing. For the early days, we actually had a person who was our recruiting coordinator, and she was scheduling these interviews by working with their recruiting coordinator. It got so clunky and so bad, and then we just went back and we're like, we're trying to make life better for candidates. They're the ones we're serving, not companies. And if companies want them, they're going to have to do things this way. But this is great because it ends up saving companies a ton of time, right? And now there are products where you can start sort of bringing this into your own process as well that do similar things, and that's the only thing that they do. But this wasn't the case when we first built it. Okay. This one was also really hard. Typically, mentioned earlier, the hiring process goes like this. First, there's a recruiter call. That call is questionably valuable, right? The recruiter is kind of asking you about your salary, which is off-putting because you don't want to give them your salary right away because then you lose some leverage for your later negotiations. Maybe they're asking you some things. They're not really well-versed enough in the end part of the business to really give you meaningful insight into that. So it's not that valuable, but that is historically how things have always been done. So a lot of our customers asked us why we're doing the technical part first, and can we just build something in our system where they can just do their normal process, do that recruiter call first, and then do the technical screen with an engineer. And we actually tried this. We didn't really feel good about it. We kind of were like, this isn't really helping candidates, but these were like big enterprise brands, and we were so thirsty to have their logos on our site. So we agreed that we would do this. None of these companies are customers because they didn't do things the way that it's meant to be done, right? Our platform is built around this very specific flow. And when we tried to do this weird side flow, candidates were confused. We didn't get data because that interview doesn't tell you anything. So we couldn't tell if we were doing a good job. And we ended up killing it and just saying, no, if you want to work with us, you have to do things in this very prescriptive way, and there's a reason we do it. And this was probably the hardest thing that we had to decide not to do. Most of our competitors in this space have sort of made a conscious decision to build tools for recruiting rather than for engineering. And that makes sense because you're getting paid by the recruiting team, right? That's the budget that you're pulling from. And recruiters are very used to using things like LinkedIn Recruiter where they can just search for candidates, right? And decide which ones they want to reach out to. We decided that we're not going to do that. Every other competitor that is in the space is doing something like this. This one, the jury is still out. It was a very, very hard decision to make. We really hope it was the right one, but it was it felt like the right thing to do because at the end of the day, candidates don't want to be pestered by recruiters. We believe candidates should be in the driver's seat, and that's what we're doing. And so far, it's made our lives a lot easier to stick to those guns. So when we said yes, even though there's a chance employers would say no, the other side of saying no, of course, is saying yes. So I mentioned earlier that organics are a big part of our business. And after word of mouth, our YouTube channel, where you can watch other people interviewing, kind of like a boring Twitch, is our best source of candidate acquisition. So at some point, our head of product came up with this crazy idea of sharing people's interviews and putting them out into the world in the hopes that it would get candidates to then use our product. And this was dangerous because even though these are practice interviews, these are not like official interviews with the company. These engineers work there, and we don't want to get anyone in trouble. And we always tell our interviewers not to ask proprietary questions, but and we kind of tested the waters and asked some of our customers who also had people doing practice interviews whether this was okay, and we just couldn't really get a definitive answer, so we ended up going for it. One company that we work with was furious and demanded that we take these interviews down, which we did for them, and everybody else has been eminently cool with it. I was a little surprised. I was very, very worried that this would be problematic, but this has been one of the best things that we've ever done for our community, right? This is so great for engineers because technical interviewing is this scary black box, right? You never know if you're doing well, you never know where you stack up against other people, and to see other people failing, like you can see the little red thumbs down, those are people that were brave enough to share their failed interviews. This has been sort of transformative for the community and demystified a lot of these really, really scary things. So last story I'll tell you about is when we should have said no to something and we didn't. Sort of a cautionary tale against leaning too heavily on your principles and your values. So I mentioned earlier that most of our users are senior engineers. And the reason that's that way is because companies generally don't want to pay for junior talent. That market looks pretty different, right? Whenever you post a job ad, if you've posted one on an angel list or something, you're probably going to get a bunch of boot campers and college seniors, right? And that's pretty much it, and you can get those without help. But if you look at the morals of the issue and kind of the flip side, your first job in a lot of ways defines the rest of your career, right? Especially if you didn't go to a good school, right? Let's say you went to bumfuck Shitsville University in Indiana or something, I don't know. And I don't know if there's a bumfuck Shitsville in Indiana, sorry. Then if you end up getting that elusive Google internship, right, or Facebook internship, your life changes. All of a sudden, recruiters are knocking on your door. You have a big stamp on your forehead that says, I'm not an idiot, that people seem to value, and you're fine. So we really wanted to sort of fix that and say, you know, the Googles and the Facebooks only visit like 5 or 10 schools, and they're the MITs and the Stanfords and the CMUs and so on and so forth. What about that long tail of smart kids all over the country that will never get to talk to a Google recruiter at a career fair? Never, like, not even thinking about how dumb and useless career fairs are. I don't know if you guys have had that experience, but generally you go, you talk to them, they take your resume, they put it in a pile, and that's it. Nothing really happens. So we said, we're just going to let on a bunch of students. They're going to practice the same way that our senior talent does, and this will essentially be like the clearinghouse for all students across the entire country. It seemed like such a cool idea, and I was so invested in it, and I thought it would be transformative. And this is, I went on the Wayback Machine today and found our old marketing site for this. It didn't work. It didn't work at all. Not just because companies don't want to pay for junior talent. We thought, you know what, they're still spending money on career fairs. So what if we just get at some of that budget and we'll show them that this is going to be 10 times more efficient than, you know, flying all those people out and wasting time standing in a booth. But what we discovered is a little bit subtle and something I didn't expect. University recruiting is expensive and inefficient and stupid, but it actually works, right? The companies with big university recruiting departments spend a ton of money every year. They go to the same schools. At the end of that recruiting cycle, they come back with their seats filled. It's not the prettiest path to filling those seats. It's not the fairest. It's not the nicest. But those seats get filled. And then you go to those people that are filling those seats, and you try to sell them something that's going to put them out of a job and cut their budgets. So it's no, I mean, in hindsight, it is no surprise that those people did not really want to buy into this. So we, long story short, we did this for about a year, like one full recruiting cycle. We ended up giving away a lot of interns and new grads for free. We sort of, depending on how like you do the accounting, we kind of broke even on it. But this was probably, we have an eng team, by the way, of like 2.5 people, right? So doing anything, like even building core features is a big distraction. Anytime I ask my engineers to do anything, I feel bad. So doing something like this was sort of catastrophic in terms of opportunity cost. So promised you I'd tell you how to say no. I can't be prescriptive about all situations. But in situations when you're saying no because something doesn't align with your mission or your values, it's actually a lot easier, right? Chances are your customers and your team understand what you're all about. And if you can formulate it that way and just sort of be honest and say, this is not why we started this company, this is not why we're doing it this way. It feels weird, but when you actually deliver that message, it's something that people understand. Especially if you're talking to your counterpart, another product person, then it's even easier. But even when it's not, this is the one case when saying no is both like relatable and understandable. So, in conclusion, were we right to say no for the reasons that we did? Like I said, I don't really know, but we do have a few pieces of data that make me feel good that some of these more controversial things are the right thing to do. We're a team of 10. We have a few million in ARR. We have 2.5 engineers and over 50 marquee customers. And up until today, we actually didn't have a sales team. Our first sales hire is somewhere in the back of that room. He started today. And we were able to get there, I think, because we found a way to align our values with what actually makes economic and pragmatic sense for our product. And one other metric that I kind of discovered recently when I dug into it is when we do paid marketing, our cost of acquisition for getting those senior engineers into our ecosystem is 10x lower than our main competitors. And I think that is directly a function of saying no to a lot of these things that don't enrich the lives of this very persnickety, opinionated group of people. Thank you very much. Let's go drink.
So, a question.
Yeah.
What if you're not sure about saying no immediately and you have to say maybe, kind of in between because you're not sure that no is the right answer?
So would this maybe be internal or is it like external?
External.
External. I'm still learning this, so like if you guys have a better answer to this, I want to hear it too. But what I found works well is figuring out the quickest way to decide if this is going to work, right? Like what's the smallest experiment that we can run? And then if a customer is asking for this and we think there might be value there, right? Kind of framing it that way. But more pragmatically, right? Sometimes customers ask you for things and they don't actually want it, right? So the first thing, like, why are they asking? Is it because they don't trust in the product? Is it because they're trying to like understand it better? Are they trying to look smart, right? There could be any number of reasons that don't affect your bottom line. So one of the first things you can ask is like, if we had this today, would you sign a contract today? And if they say that, unless it's something that's morally repugnant, as per the talk, then you just you say you have it, and then you like stay up all night and you build it, right? But in cases where it's not clear to you or them whether it's something they want, work together, come up with some kind of benchmarks, right, and keep each other accountable, and decide how much. Maybe it's not even worth it to you to find out, like, what is the biggest upside? If this is something that's going to increase your ARR by 10K a month, depending on what, it might not be worth it. If it's a game changer, then you scope those experiments carefully, and then you put your long-suffering 2.5 engineers on that. Yep. So we do. So the question was, we make money. Thank you for looking at our website. We make money in two ways. One is like a recruiter, where you take a percentage of a candidate's first year's base salary. That's not our preferred way of making money. Our preferred way is when we get our bigger customers onto a subscription, and then they pay us basically either for candidate flow or for some like package of hires that they pay for upfront. For us, subscriptions are much better, and there are a few reasons for that. One is sort of going back to this idea of values. When you get paid for making hires, whether you like it or not, all of a sudden you're a recruiter, right? So like I am become, destroyer of worlds, like kind of, and it's very, very hard to fight against like practical incentives. So you want to try to align everything so it actually like does the thing you want. If you are getting paid per hire, you can find yourself pressuring candidates to take the offer that is the highest amount of money. You can find yourself pressuring candidates to sign the first offer that they get because you need cash in the bank. And then you find yourself starting to hire people whose job it is to chase candidates and make them sign offers and get a commission. And then you are a recruiting agency. So the reason we prefer subscriptions is because then we are truly aligned with candidates, right? Then, hey, candidate, here's the world, roll out the red carpet, here are all these companies, talk to as many or as few as you want. We're getting paid every time now you talk to a company, so we're just sitting there happy, right? And we want you to keep talking to them until you find the right fit, because if you're happy, then you're gonna come back for your next job search, and about 66% of our users do that. Did I actually answer your question? I kind of went on a rant.
I think you did. So you kind of do have a preference, and you do try to guide people.
Yeah, I mean, often like the contingency is like a way of trying out, like you heard our sales pitch, talk to randos, right? So if you can de-risk that for them and say only pay us if you make a hire, then they're more likely to try it. And then if they have success, then you try to get them on subscription as soon as possible. Are there questions? Okay. Oh, yes. Okay.
Thanks. Great presentation, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I probably wouldn't be alone in saying that your approach seems like very revolutionary in that it seems that your customer is the employer, and yet your values focus on not your customer.
Yes.
And then at the same time, you've also managed to convince your customer in somewhat of a prescriptive way, like, no, we won't integrate with your ATS. You have to use our scheduling system. So with all of that in mind, I feel like it's difficult to get to a position where you can get traction with your customer base when you have such values and approaches. Was there, just out of curiosity, was there a moment when you started seeing that this sort of sticking to your guns principles started really getting traction? Was there like an aha moment where you realized actually this is gonna work?
Yeah, when we started signing like $200,000 deals, like upfront for 1 year of candidate flow from like giant companies with big recruiting teams, we're like, shit. Well, first we're like, shit, we actually have to deliver those candidates, but then this is actually working. What we have found, and by the way, we do have ATS integration, but it's only like after. So if a candidate does well in an interview, then of course we put them into the ATS, so we reduce any friction for the company moving forward with them. But sort of the main times that our customers have had issue with our process change and haven't wanted to renew, and that has happened, of course, or haven't wanted to switch from a contingent to a subscription agreement, is when either we failed them on candidate quality or when we failed them on candidate volume. At that point, it's not worth it to them because they're not seeing that like 3x conversion rate improvement, and they're not seeing, like if we gave all our customers a ton of great candidates, I am convinced that they would undergo any process changes that we want. There was actually this was kind of telling, one of our big enterprise customers, I won't say which one, but we pitched them on our university program, which was a failed enterprise in a lot of ways. And they're like, we have to look into compliance. We're worried about like interviewing candidates before like we officially have an application for them. And here's like this long list of rules. And they're like, we're not going to do it. And then we went back to that same company maybe a year later, and we're like, hey, we have a bunch of like senior, like 7+ years senior engineers, and they're like, fuck compliance, yeah, like give us those candidates, right? So a lot of the time, like hemming and hawing about process and security, and not always, security sometimes there's nothing you can do about, but like all of these things are sort of a polite way of saying you're not actually adding enough value for us to justify doing the weird shit you want us to do.
Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Anyone else?
Great. Thank you, Aline.
All right, drinking.